The Breakdown Before the Breakthrough. Written and narrated by MSE Boost. Everything you've been taught about strength is wrong. Not slightly off. Not outdated. Fundamentally, dangerously wrong. The people who told you to hold it together, to push through, to keep your composure, no matter what, they weren't trying to help you thrive. They were trying to help you survive in a system that rewards the appearance of stability over actual psychological health. And that advice, however well-intentioned, has likely cost you years of your life spent propping up structures that were never going to hold the weight of who you're becoming. Here's what makes this particularly insidious. The pressure to maintain composure doesn't announce itself as harmful. It arrives disguised as maturity, professionalism, and emotional intelligence. You've been praised for keeping your cool. You've been rewarded for not falling apart when others did. You've built an identity around being the person who handles things, who stays calm, who never lets them see you sweat. And every single time you received that praise, you were being trained to delay a reckoning that your psyche desperately needed. Chapter 1. The Lie About Keeping It Together. The breakdown you've been running from isn't your enemy. It never was. That collapse you've been white-knuckling your way around for months or years represents something far more significant than failure or weakness. It's the demolition crew your life has been calling for, the necessary dismantling of patterns that stopped serving you long before you were willing to admit it. The breakdown isn't the problem. Your exhausting efforts to prevent it, that's the problem. Most people treat psychological breakdowns the way they'd treat a house fire, as disasters to be prevented at all costs. Emergencies that signal something has gone catastrophically wrong. This framing makes intuitive sense. Breakdowns hurt. They disrupt. They scare the people around us. They threaten jobs, relationships, and social standing. Of course, we want to avoid them. But consider what actually happens when you successfully prevent a breakdown. The pressure doesn't disappear. The misalignment between your life and your needs doesn't resolve itself. The accumulated weight of suppressed emotions, ignored intuitions, and postponed reckonings doesn't evaporate just because you managed to hold yourself together for another day, another week, another year. That pressure finds other outlets. It leaks into your body as chronic tension, mysterious ailments, and exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix. It seeps into your relationships as irritability, emotional unavailability, and reactions disproportionate to their triggers. It infiltrates your mind as anxiety, depression, and a persistent sense that something is wrong, even when nothing obvious explains the feeling. You've been treating the breakdown as the disease when it's actually the cure. The collapse you've been avoiding isn't the source of your suffering. It's the release valve your system has been trying to activate while you keep slamming it shut. Think about what happens when you successfully hold it together through a period that genuinely called for falling apart. You white-knuckle your way through the crisis. You maintain your responsibilities. You keep showing up, keep performing, keep meeting expectations. And when the acute pressure passes, you feel a brief moment of relief, maybe even pride. You did it. You held on. But something shifts after that. A low-grade exhaustion settles in that wasn't there before. Your capacity for stress decreases rather than increases. You find yourself more reactive, more easily overwhelmed, more prone to snapping at small inconveniences. The very act of holding yourself together depleted reserves that don't automatically replenish. You survived, yes, but you didn't just survive, you also taught your nervous system that this is how things work now, that the appropriate response to overwhelming pressure is to clench harder and push through regardless of cost. This is how people end up having massive breakdowns over seemingly minor triggers. They've been successfully preventing smaller necessary collapses for so long that the accumulated pressure finally ruptures at the least opportune moment, over the least significant catalyst, in ways that feel completely disproportionate and utterly bewildering. They wonder what's wrong with them. They can't understand why they're falling apart over a traffic jam or a misplaced phone or a mildly critical comment when they handled genuinely serious crises without flinching. The answer is simple. They were never actually handling those crises. They were postponing the processing, and the bill eventually comes due with interest. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from extended maintenance of a structure that should have collapsed long ago. If you've ever stayed too long in a job that crushed your spirit, a living situation that drained your energy, or a version of yourself that no longer fit who you were becoming, you know this exhaustion intimately. It's different from being tired after hard work. It's the specific fatigue of holding something together that your entire being knows needs to fall apart. This exhaustion carries information. Your body is not confused. Your nervous system is not malfunctioning. The persistent depletion you feel despite adequate sleep. The heaviness that doesn't lift despite addressing obvious stressors. The sense of running on fumes, even when life looks fine from the outside. These aren't problems to be solved through better self-care or more disciplined routines. They're signals that you're expending enormous energy maintaining something that needs to be released. The lie about keeping it together assumes that stability is always the goal, that maintaining current structures is inherently valuable, that the ability to persist without disruption represents strength. But stability in service of what? Maintaining which structures? Persisting toward what end? These questions rarely get asked because the answers might require action that feels too frightening to contemplate. When you successfully hold together a life that doesn't fit you, a career that contradicts your values, a self-concept that requires constant performance to maintain, you're not demonstrating strength. You're demonstrating a particular kind of endurance. Yes, but it's the endurance of a person walking in the wrong direction who refuses to stop. Because stopping would mean admitting the hours already walked were wasted. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let something fall apart. The distinction between a productive breakdown and destructive spiraling matters enormously, and most people have never learned to tell the difference. A productive breakdown, despite its intensity and discomfort, moves you toward something. It releases pressure that was preventing necessary change. It clears space that was being occupied by structures that had outlived their usefulness. It forces confrontation with truths you'd been successfully avoiding. Destructive spiraling, by contrast, moves you in circles. The same thoughts replay without resolution. The same emotions cycle without discharge. The intensity persists without producing any shift in understanding or direction. You fall apart and fall apart and fall apart. But nothing actually changes except your capacity to function decreases. Here's how to recognize which you're experiencing. Productive breakdowns, even at their most painful, contain moments of clarity. You suddenly see something you couldn't see before. You understand a pattern that had been invisible. You feel the rightness of releasing something you'd been gripping too tightly. The pain is acute, but it's moving somewhere. There's a sense, however faint, that this destruction is making room for something else. Destructive spiraling feels like being trapped in a loop. The same thoughts cycle endlessly. You're not moving toward any realization, you're just suffering. There's no growing clarity, no emerging understanding, just repetitive pain that feeds on itself. You feel worse over time rather than differently over time. The breakdown isn't dismantling anything that needed to fall. It's just eroding your capacity to function without producing any corresponding insight or release. Productive breakdowns often follow a pattern of building pressure around a specific misalignment. Something in your life has been wrong for a while. You've been managing it, working around it, telling yourself it's fine. The breakdown comes when that management strategy finally fails, when the misalignment can no longer be accommodated. There's usually a recognizable source, even if you've been avoiding looking at it directly. Destructive spiraling often lacks this specificity. You're falling apart, but you couldn't clearly articulate what's actually wrong. Or you're falling apart about many things simultaneously, without any sense of priority or connection between them. The collapse isn't organized around anything in particular. It's a generalized failure of your coping capacity. The practical value of this distinction lies in what it tells you to do. If you're experiencing a productive breakdown, the worst thing you can do is try to stop it prematurely. You need to let the demolition complete. The structure coming down needed to come down, and interrupting the process just means you'll have to go through it again later, possibly under worse circumstances. Your job during a productive breakdown is to keep yourself physically safe. Maintain minimum viable functioning in areas that can't be neglected, and otherwise allow the collapse to proceed. If you're experiencing destructive spiraling, you need intervention. Something has gone wrong with the breakdown process itself. You're not processing toward resolution. You're cycling in place. This is when professional support becomes important, when medication might be appropriate, when your job shifts from allowing the collapse to interrupting a malfunction. Most people can't make this distinction because they've been taught to treat all breakdowns as emergencies to be stopped. They never learned that some collapses are exactly what's supposed to happen. The mental shift required to work with a breakdown rather than against it contradicts everything you've been conditioned to believe about psychological strength. You've been taught that strong people don't fall apart. You've been taught that composure is a virtue, that handling things well means handling them smoothly, that the goal is always to maintain function and minimize disruption. Working with your breakdown requires a fundamental reframe. What if falling apart is sometimes exactly what handling things well looks like? What if the disruption is the point? What if maintaining function was never the highest goal, when the function being maintained was keeping you stuck? This doesn't mean seeking out breakdowns or treating every difficult emotion as a signal to collapse. The goal isn't to become someone who falls apart constantly. The goal is to stop treating necessary breakdowns as failures to be prevented and start treating them as processes to be supported. The difference is significant. When you treat a breakdown as a failure, you fight it. You resist. You try to maintain control. You add the weight of self-judgment to whatever you're already carrying. You interpret your collapse as evidence that you're weak, broken, incapable. And all of that additional weight makes the breakdown harder, longer, and less productive than it needs to be. When you treat a breakdown as a process, you work with it. You don't add unnecessary resistance. You conserve energy for the rebuilding that will follow rather than wasting it fighting the inevitable. You stay curious about what the breakdown is revealing rather than shame spiraling about the fact that it's happening. You recognize that you're not falling apart because something is wrong with you. You're falling apart because something was wrong with how you were living, and your system is finally addressing it. This reframe alone from breakdown as failure to breakdown as process can transform your experience of falling apart. Not make it painless, not make it easy, but make it productive rather than purely destructive, meaningful rather than just miserable. The cultural pressure to maintain composure has a history worth understanding, because that history reveals how arbitrary and constructed these expectations actually are. The specific version of emotional control you've been trained to perform isn't universal to human experience or necessary for human flourishing. It's a particular cultural product, shaped by particular economic and social forces, serving particular interests that may have nothing to do with your actual well-being. The social dynamics that make emotional expression uncomfortable for others weren't created to help you process difficult experiences effectively. They were created to protect other people from the discomfort of witnessing your distress. When friends or family members praise you for holding it together, they're often expressing relief that they don't have to deal with your emotions, not genuine admiration for your coping capacity. Their comfort and your healing are different things. The internal narratives that tell you falling apart is shameful, weak, or evidence of personal failure weren't developed through careful examination of what actually helps humans grow and thrive. They were absorbed from a culture that has its own reasons for wanting you to maintain function regardless of cost. Your shame about breaking down serves someone else's agenda. None of this means that the people around you are villains, or that the culture is deliberately conspiring against your mental health. These dynamics emerge from systems that developed for their own reasons, most of which had nothing to do with optimizing individual psychological development. But recognizing that the pressure to maintain composure serves purposes other than your well-being can loosen its grip on you. The next time you feel ashamed of falling apart, you might ask yourself, whose interests does this shame serve? And is serving those interests more important than allowing yourself the breakdown you need? There's a particular moment in the lead up to a breakdown when you can feel it coming. The structure hasn't collapsed yet, but you can sense its instability. Your usual coping mechanisms aren't working as well as they used to. Small things trigger bigger reactions than they should. You're more tired, more reactive, more aware of the gap between how you're functioning and how you're actually feeling. This moment, the pre-breakdown awareness, represents a choice point that most people don't recognize. The default response is to double down on holding it together. You notice the instability and respond by gripping harder, managing more intensely, deploying every tool you have to prevent the collapse you can feel approaching. Sometimes this works temporarily. You postpone the breakdown for another few weeks or months, but the pressure doesn't decrease. It just continues building until the next near collapse, and the next, each one requiring more effort to suppress than the last. The alternative response, the one almost no one takes because almost no one knows it's an option, is to recognize the pre-breakdown moment as an opportunity. You can feel the instability because something is ready to shift. The structure is weakening because it needs to fall. Instead of fighting to maintain what's already failing, you could begin the process of controlled demolition. Controlled demolition looks different from catastrophic collapse. Instead of waiting until the breakdown happens to you, in the least convenient moment, in front of the people you least want to witness it, you create conditions for it to happen safely. You clear your schedule. You reduce your obligations to the minimum viable level. You let trusted people know you're going through something difficult. You stop pretending everything is fine and start acknowledging, at least to yourself, that the current structure isn't working. This approach requires something that controlled people rarely have: permission to fall apart before circumstances force you to. That permission almost never comes from external sources. Your job won't give you breakdown leave. Your family probably won't offer to handle everything while you process whatever needs processing. The permission has to come from you, which means it requires valuing your psychological health enough to prioritize it over the inconvenience and disruption that intentional falling apart will cause. Most people don't reach this point until they've already had several uncontrolled breakdowns. They've experienced the cost of catastrophic collapse enough times that controlled demolition starts to seem appealing by comparison. If you're reading this before hitting that point, consider yourself fortunate enough to learn from others' experiences rather than requiring your own repeated disasters. The breakdown you've been preventing might be the best thing that could happen to you right now. Not because suffering is virtuous. Not because you need to be torn down to be rebuilt. But because the current structure, whatever combination of roles, relationships, habits, beliefs, and patterns constitutes your present life, may have stopped serving you long before you were willing to admit it. When that structure finally falls, several things become possible that weren't possible before. Clarity emerges. The mental bandwidth you were spending on maintenance becomes available for honest assessment. Questions you couldn't afford to ask while holding everything together suddenly demand answers. What do you actually want? What have you been tolerating that you can no longer tolerate? What would you build if you could build anything? These questions feel dangerous when you're invested in maintaining the current structure. They feel necessary once that structure has fallen. Energy returns. Not immediately. Breakdowns are exhausting and recovery takes time. But eventually, the energy you are spending on suppression, on performance, on the constant effort of holding together something that wanted to fall becomes available for other purposes. People who've been through significant breakdowns often describe feeling lighter afterward, more vital, more present. The weight they were carrying wasn't just the difficult circumstances. It was the accumulated effort of preventing the breakdown itself. Change becomes possible while you're successfully holding it together. Fundamental change feels too risky. You can't overhaul your career when you're barely managing your current responsibilities. You can't transform your daily patterns when all your energy goes to maintaining what already exists. You can't become a different person when being your current self requires everything you have. The breakdown clears the field. It removes the structures that were blocking change. It creates conditions where transformation isn't just possible, but inevitable, because the old form no longer exists to return to. None of this makes breakdowns pleasant or something to seek out recreationally. The process hurts. The disorientation is real. The fear of what comes next can be overwhelming. But understanding what becomes possible on the other side can help you stop treating your breakdown as a disaster and start treating it as the necessary destruction that precedes building something better. You've spent years, possibly decades, believing that your ability to hold it together was a strength. Every time you pushed through when you wanted to fall apart. Every time you maintained composure when everything inside you was screaming. Every time you showed up and performed and met expectations despite being depleted beyond what should be sustainable, you counted those as wins. Evidence of your resilience. Proof of your capability. Demonstrations of the strength that makes you valuable. What if those weren't wins at all? What if every successful prevention of a necessary breakdown was actually a loss, a postponement of healing, a delay of transformation, a victory for short-term function at the cost of long-term flourishing? This question isn't meant to shame you for coping the best way you knew how. Holding it together was a rational response to the pressures you faced with the understanding you had. You did what you were taught to do, what you were rewarded for doing, what everyone around you seemed to expect. There's no value in beating yourself up for following the only playbook you were given. But the question matters because your answer shapes what you do next. If holding it together was strength and breaking down is weakness, you'll continue the pattern. You'll keep suppressing, keep managing, keep white-knuckling your way through experiences that your psyche needs to process differently. You'll keep trading long-term well-being for short-term function until the accumulated cost becomes too great to ignore. If you can consider the alternative, that controlled falling apart might serve you better than endless holding on, something shifts. The breakdown stops being the enemy. The collapse stops being the thing to prevent at all costs. You stop spending energy fighting something that might be trying to help you. The chapters ahead will show you what to do when you've already hit bottom, how to convert the energy of destruction into fuel for forward motion, how to build something new from what remains, and who you become on the other side of genuine transformation. But none of that matters if you're still committed to preventing the breakdown that makes all of it possible. The lie about keeping it together has cost you enough. Your willingness to let it fall apart is where everything changes. Chapter 2: What to do when you've already hit bottom. You're on the floor. Maybe literally, maybe metaphorically, but the distinction doesn't matter much right now. The breakdown you spent so long preventing has arrived, and every piece of advice about how to avoid this moment has become irrelevant. Prevention failed. You're here. This is where most books abandon you. They'll tell you endlessly how to build resilience, how to manage stress before it becomes unmanageable, how to develop coping mechanisms that keep you functional. What they won't tell you is what to do when all of that has stopped working, and you're staring at the ceiling at 3 and wondering how you're supposed to function tomorrow when you can barely function right now. The gap between practice self-care and actually surviving the acute phase of a breakdown could fill an ocean. What happens in the next 72 hours matters more than you realize. The immediate aftermath of a breakdown isn't just something to endure, it's a critical window that shapes everything that follows. The actions you take, the decisions you make, and the mistakes you avoid during this period will determine whether your breakdown leads to genuine transformation or extended suffering. You're not powerless here. You're not just waiting for the pain to pass. You have more influence over your trajectory than it feels like you do. And this chapter will show you exactly how to use it. Your body doesn't care about your breakdown. That sounds harsh, but understanding this truth will save you from a cascade of secondary problems that make everything worse. While your mind is processing whatever crisis brought you here, your physical self continues operating according to its own requirements. Blood sugar still drops. Sleep debt still accumulates. Muscles still tense. Hydration still matters. Your body will not pause its needs because you're going through something difficult. And ignoring those needs while focusing entirely on your psychological state creates physical problems that amplify your emotional distress. The first few hours after a breakdown often involve complete neglect of physical basics. Food becomes uninteresting or nauseating. Sleep feels impossible despite exhaustion. Movement seems pointless when everything feels pointless. This neglect makes sense emotionally. Why would you care about eating when your life feels like it's falling apart? But it creates a downward spiral that extends your suffering significantly. Low blood sugar produces anxiety, irritability, and impaired thinking. These symptoms feel like part of your breakdown, like evidence that you're falling apart even more, when they're actually just your body responding to not being fed. Sleep deprivation triggers emotional dysregulation, difficulty concentrating, and increased perception of threat. Again, these feel like psychological symptoms when they're physiological ones. The breakdown is hard enough without adding preventable physical contributors to your distress. Eating during a breakdown doesn't require cooking elaborate meals or maintaining your normal diet. Anything that gets calories and some protein into your system counts as success. A handful of nuts. A piece of bread with peanut butter. A protein shake if solid food feels impossible. The goal isn't nutrition optimization. It's preventing your blood sugar from crashing while you deal with everything else. Keep simple, no preparation foods within reach. Crackers, fruit, cheese, granola bars, whatever you can consume without effort. Your standard for food intake during this period should be low enough that you can actually meet it. Sleep during a breakdown operates differently than normal sleep. You might be exhausted, but unable to sleep, or sleeping constantly, but never feeling rested, or oscillating between insomnia and hypersomnia without warning. Fighting against whatever pattern emerges usually makes things worse. If you can't sleep despite exhaustion, lying in darkness with your eyes closed still provides some rest, even if it feels useless. If you're sleeping 14 hours a day, your system might genuinely need that recovery time. The exception is when sleep becomes a complete avoidance mechanism, staying unconscious to escape what you're feeling rather than because your body needs rest. That pattern requires gentle interruption, not because sleep is bad, but because complete avoidance extends the process unnecessarily. Movement matters during this period in ways that might surprise you. Not exercise in the traditional sense. Nobody's asking you to go to the gym during a breakdown. But the complete physical stillness that often accompanies acute distress creates its own problems. Emotional intensity gets stored in the body when there's no physical release. Tension accumulates in muscles. Stress hormones that would normally be processed through movement instead circulate continuously. A short walk, even just around your living space, helps your nervous system process what it's experiencing. Gentle stretching releases some of the physical tension that accumulates during psychological crisis. These aren't solutions to your breakdown, they're support for your body while the breakdown runs its course. The decisions you make during the acute phase of a breakdown fall into two categories, and failing to distinguish between them causes enormous unnecessary damage. Some decisions genuinely cannot wait. Others feel urgent, but can and should be postponed until you're in a better state to make them. Decisions that cannot wait tend to involve immediate safety, time-sensitive obligations, and other people's welfare. If something is dangerous right now, you need to address it now. If you have responsibilities to others that will create serious problems, if neglected children who need care, medications that must be taken, time-critical work obligations, those require attention, even when you're struggling. These decisions don't require you to be at your best. They just require minimum viable function. Decisions that can wait include almost everything else, regardless of how urgent they feel. Should you quit your job? That can wait. Should you end your relationship? That can wait. Should you move to a different city? Confront someone about a long-standing issue? Make any major life change that's been on your mind? All of those can wait. The sense of urgency you feel around these decisions is a symptom of your breakdown, not an accurate assessment of their actual timeline. This distinction matters because people in crisis tend to make dramatic decisions. The clarity that sometimes accompanies a breakdown, the sudden ability to see what's wrong, what needs to change, what you've been tolerating that you shouldn't have been, can feel like a mandate for immediate action. You finally see it clearly. You need to fix it now. Every day you wait is another day living a lie. This urgency is almost always misleading. The clarity is real, but the timeline is manufactured by your distressed state. Whatever insights your breakdown is generating will still be valid next week, next month, after you've stabilized. If quitting your job is genuinely the right call, it will still be the right call once you're sleeping again and eating properly and capable of implementing the decision thoughtfully rather than dramatically. The practical application. During the acute phase of your breakdown, make a list of decisions that feel urgent. Look at each one and ask whether delaying it by 2 weeks would create serious concrete consequences. Not discomfort consequences. Not the feeling that you'll lose your nerve, actual problems. For almost every decision on your list, the answer will be no. Those decisions go into a holding pattern. You're not ignoring them. You're acknowledging that your current state isn't the right state for making them. The few decisions that genuinely can't wait get your attention, and everything else waits. This approach prevents the secondary damage that often follows breakdowns. People quit jobs impulsively during crises and find themselves unemployed while still too fragile to job search effectively. People end relationships in the heat of breakdown and then have to navigate the aftermath while lacking the emotional resources to do so well. People make proclamations, burn bridges, and take dramatic actions that feel necessary in the moment, but create problems that outlast the breakdown itself. You have permission to postpone almost everything. Use that permission liberally. Communication during a breakdown involves navigating a genuine dilemma. Isolating completely tends to extend suffering. Humans are social creatures, and going through crisis entirely alone often makes things worse. Sharing indiscriminately creates its own problems. Not everyone in your life can hold what you're going through, and some people will respond in ways that make things harder. The challenge is figuring out what to share, with whom, and how to handle the people you can't share with. Some people in your life can be trusted with the truth of what you're experiencing. These are people who won't panic, won't try to fix you, won't make your breakdown about themselves, won't spread information you'd prefer to keep private. They can simply be present with you while you're struggling without adding to your burden. You probably already know who these people are. They've demonstrated their capacity through past experiences. They respond to difficulty with steadiness rather than drama. Lean on these people during your breakdown. Let them know what's happening. Accept support from them, even if accepting support feels uncomfortable. Other people in your life cannot handle your current state, and telling them the full truth will create problems you don't need right now. Maybe they panic easily, and their panic will amplify your distress. Maybe they're prone to giving advice you haven't asked for. Maybe they gossip, or they'll try to orchestrate interventions, or they have their own issues with you that will surface unhelpfully during your vulnerability. Maybe they're simply not capable of sitting with someone else's pain without making it about themselves. For these people, you need a holding statement, something that acknowledges you're going through a difficult period without providing details that will trigger problematic responses. I'm dealing with some personal stuff right now and need some space works for most situations. It's not something I can talk about yet, but I appreciate you checking in. Handles persistent inquiry. I'm okay, just need some time satisfies casual concern. These statements aren't lies, they're boundaries. You're not obligated to share the details of your breakdown with people who can't handle them constructively. The workplace presents particular challenges. Depending on your job, your relationship with your manager, and your company's culture, you may or may not have the option of honest disclosure. Some workplaces respond to employee struggles with genuine support and flexibility. Others respond with documentation trails and performance concerns. You know which kind you work in. If disclosure feels safe and would result in useful accommodations, a few days off, adjusted deadlines, temporary reduction in responsibilities, consider it. If disclosure feels risky or wouldn't result in meaningful support anyway, use sick days if you have them, cite vague health issues, and protect yourself. Your psychological health is a legitimate reason to take time off work. Whether you frame it that way to your employer depends on what's strategically wise, not on what's honest. Social obligations during a breakdown should be minimized ruthlessly. Cancel plans. Postpone commitments. Send apologetic texts explaining you can't make it without providing detailed explanations. The energy required to show up socially while you're falling apart is energy diverted from your actual recovery. Some people will be understanding. Others will be annoyed. Their annoyance is less important than your stabilization. You can repair social damage later from a position of strength. You can't recover effectively while draining yourself through obligations you don't have the capacity to meet. Creating minimal viable structure during chaos sounds contradictory, but it serves a crucial function. When everything feels like it's falling apart, having even a tiny framework for your days prevents complete dissolution. This isn't about maintaining your normal routine that's probably impossible right now, and trying to do so will just add failure to your list of problems. This is about creating enough structure to stay tethered without overwhelming yourself with expectations you can't meet. Minimal viable structure during a breakdown might look like this. Wake up at roughly the same time each day, within a 2-hour window. Eat something within the first hour of waking. Shower every day or every other day. Get outside for at least 10 minutes, even if just sitting on your doorstep. Go to bed at roughly the same time each night. That's it. That's enough. That's your structure. This level of routine provides several benefits without demanding too much. Your circadian rhythm stays somewhat regulated, which supports whatever sleep you're able to get. Your body gets minimum inputs it needs. You have something to accomplish each day that's actually accomplishable. The small wins of meeting these minimal expectations counter the pervasive sense of failure that often accompanies breakdowns. You showered. You ate something. You went outside. These aren't impressive accomplishments under normal circumstances, but they matter during crisis. The temptation will be to either maintain your full pre-breakdown routine or abandon routine entirely. Both approaches create problems. Trying to maintain your normal level of productivity while in crisis sets you up for repeated failure, each failure reinforcing the sense that you can't cope. Abandoning routine entirely removes the scaffolding that helps your days have shape, leading to dissolution where hours blur together and basic self-maintenance falls apart completely. The middle path: reduced structure, minimal expectations. Something rather than nothing threads between these failure modes. Building your minimal structure requires honestly assessing what you can handle right now. Not what you should be able to handle, not what you could handle before, not what you're embarrassed to admit is your current capacity, what you can actually handle today. Start lower than you think necessary. A structure you can meet consistently serves you better than an ambitious structure you keep failing to maintain. You can always add more structure as you stabilize. You can't keep failing at too much structure without damaging your sense of capability. The common mistakes people make during breakdowns often extend suffering far beyond what the original crisis warranted. Knowing what not to do is sometimes more valuable than knowing what to do, because the wrong actions can create secondary problems that take longer to resolve than the breakdown itself. Substance use during breakdown is extremely common and extremely counterproductive. Alcohol seems to help with anxiety and emotional pain, and it does, briefly, before making both worse. The rebound effect after drinking produces heightened anxiety, disrupted sleep, and depressed mood, all of which intensify whatever you are trying to escape. The same applies to cannabis for many people during acute distress. What feels like relief in the moment creates a cycle where the aftermath of using becomes additional disturbance layered on top of your existing state. This isn't a lecture about substances being bad in general. It's specific guidance that using them during psychological crisis typically extends the crisis. Seeking reassurance compulsively makes things worse, even though it feels like it should help. The urge to repeatedly ask others whether you're going to be okay, whether they still love you, whether everything is ruined, this urge comes from genuine distress. But satisfying it provides only momentary relief before the anxiety returns, often stronger than before. Each round of reassurance teaches your brain that the threat is real enough to require reassurance, paradoxically increasing anxiety over time. Limit yourself to asking once. Get your answer. Then resist the urge to ask again, recognizing that the urge itself is a symptom rather than a signal that you need more information. Making major announcements during breakdown satisfies an urge for relief through action, but typically creates regret. The desire to tell everyone exactly what you're feeling, to post on social media about your crisis, to send long emotional messages to people explaining your state, these urges stem from the pressure of containing your experience alone. Acting on them feels liberating briefly before the consequences arrive. You've now shared things you might wish you hadn't, with people who might use the information unhelpfully, in ways you can't take back. If you feel the urge to make announcements, write them out privately. Get the satisfaction of articulating your experience without the consequences of broadcasting it. You can always choose to share later from a more stable place. Forcing yourself to function normally when you can't is a form of self-harm during breakdown. The determination to maintain your usual productivity, social presence, and life management, while in crisis, doesn't demonstrate strength. It demonstrates denial about your current state and produces failures that compound your distress. Each time you try to function normally and can't, you add evidence for the narrative that you're broken, incapable, falling apart worse than you realized. Accepting reduced function during crisis isn't giving up. It's accurately assessing your current capacity and working within it. You'll function normally again. That time isn't now. Distinguishing between necessary processing and indulgent wallowing requires more nuance than the standard, just snap out of it, advice acknowledges. Both states involve feeling your feelings rather than suppressing them. Both involve reduced function compared to your baseline. From the outside, they can look identical, but their effects on your recovery trajectory differ substantially, and learning to tell them apart helps you support your breakdown without extending it unnecessarily. Necessary processing has a quality of movement to it, even when that movement is slow and painful. You're feeling things because those things need to be felt. Each wave of emotion, while difficult, is accomplishing something: discharging stored distress, integrating difficult realizations, allowing your system to release what it's been holding. After a period of processing, you feel different. Not necessarily better, sometimes worse temporarily, but shifted. Something has moved through you. Indulgent wallowing lacks this quality of movement. You're feeling things, but the same things, repeatedly, without discharge or integration. There's often a subtle satisfaction in wallowing, a sense of justifying your position or proving how badly you've been hurt. The emotions don't move through you, they recirculate. After a period of wallowing, you feel the same as before, or worse, with nothing having shifted except your energy has depleted further. The practical test. After an hour of allowing yourself to feel whatever you're feeling, do you have any new understanding? Any shift in your emotional state, even a slight one? Any sense that something has completed? If yes, that was likely necessary processing, and you should continue allowing it even though it's difficult. If nothing has shifted and you're exactly where you started, you've likely drifted into wallowing, and a pattern interrupt would serve you better than continued emotional immersion. Pattern interrupts during wallowing don't require you to feel better or deny your pain. They simply redirect your attention temporarily. Cold water on your face, a short walk outside, calling someone and talking about anything other than your crisis, watching something engaging enough to hold your attention. These interrupts don't solve anything. They break the recirculation pattern that wallowing creates. Often, after a pattern interrupt, you can return to processing your emotions and find that actual movement happens where there was only circulation before. The people around you during your breakdown will respond in various ways, and learning to manage those responses is part of managing your crisis. Some responses genuinely help. Others make things worse despite good intentions. Knowing the difference protects you from absorbing additional distress during a period when you have no spare capacity. Helpful responses share certain qualities. They make space for your experience without trying to change it immediately. They ask what you need rather than assuming. They stay present without withdrawing or becoming overwhelmed. They validate that what you're going through is hard without reinforcing hopelessness. They offer practical support food, help with tasks, physical presence without conditions or expectations. They trust that you'll emerge from this without requiring you to perform recovery on their timeline. Unhelpful responses come from good intentions, but miss the mark. Premature reassurance, "You're going to be fine," dismisses your current reality and requires you to manage the other person's discomfort rather than your own experience. Excessive problem solving converts your emotional crisis into a puzzle to be fixed, which both misses the point and adds pressure to implement solutions you don't have capacity for. Competitive suffering. "I know exactly how you feel when I went through." Redirects attention away from you and often minimizes your experience through comparison. Panic and excessive concern make your breakdown about their anxiety, adding their distress to your load. You cannot control how people respond, but you can limit your exposure to responses that make things worse. This might mean telling certain people less, seeing certain people less frequently, or explicitly requesting different types of support. "I appreciate you wanting to help, but what I need right now is just to be heard, not to fix anything," redirects problem solvers. "Your worry is making me more anxious. I need you to trust that I'm going to get through this," addresses excessive concern. "I don't need advice right now, just presence," sets boundaries with the advice prone. These requests feel awkward to make, but protecting your limited energy during crisis is not optional. Some people will be unable or unwilling to provide what you need regardless of how you communicate. This is information about them, not a failure of your communication or a reflection of your worth. During your breakdown is not the time to fix these dynamics. Note who shows up in helpful ways and who doesn't. That information will be useful later. For now, simply direct your limited social energy toward the people who help and away from the people who don't. The physical environment you're in during your breakdown shapes your experience more than you might expect. Crisis tends to create chaos. Dishes pile up, clutter accumulates, mail goes unopened, living spaces deteriorate. This environmental decay mirrors your internal state and reinforces it. You feel like a mess, your space looks like a mess, and each reinforces the other. You don't need to deep clean your home during a breakdown. That expectation is unrealistic and adds failure when you inevitably can't meet it. But small environmental improvements create disproportionate benefits. Making your bed, if you can manage it, gives you one ordered space in the chaos. Clearing one surface, a kitchen counter, a desk, a coffee table, provides visual rest. Opening curtains lets in natural light, which affects mood and circadian rhythm. Taking out trash that's accumulated removes something actively decaying from your space. These aren't requirements. If you can't manage any environmental maintenance, that's okay. But if you have moments of slightly more capacity, directing that capacity towards small environmental improvements serves you well. The psychological benefit of even minor order in your external environment exceeds the effort required to create it. Something in your life is under control. Something is clean, or organized, or handled. These small islands of order matter when everything else feels chaotic. The sensory environment also warrants attention. Harsh lighting, loud sounds, uncomfortable temperatures, and unpleasant smells add to your nervous system's burden during a period when it's already overwhelmed. Soft lighting is more regulating than bright lighting. Quiet or gentle background sound is more supportive than silence, which the mind tends to fill with rumination. Comfortable temperature, whatever that means for you, removes one source of physiological stress. Pleasant scents, a candle, essential oils, fresh air provide positive sensory input that's missing when you're too distressed to seek it out. These adjustments are minor, but during breakdown, you're operating with such reduced capacity that minor supports make noticeable differences. Sleep during breakdown deserves specific attention because it affects everything else and presents particular challenges. The relationship between sleep and psychological distress runs in both directions. Poor sleep intensifies emotional dysregulation, impaired thinking, and negative mood. Emotional distress disrupts sleep quality and duration. This bidirectional relationship means that whatever you can do to support sleep during your breakdown will reduce the intensity of everything else you're experiencing. Sleep hygiene advice you've heard 1,000 times applies here, but needs adaptation for your current state. Keeping a consistent sleep schedule matters, but consistent during breakdown might mean a wider window than usual, going to bed within the same 2-hour range, waking within the same 2-hour range. Avoiding screens before bed matters, but if you're using your phone to distract yourself from unbearable thoughts, that might be a reasonable trade-off. The principles are the same. The application is more flexible. If you're experiencing insomnia, lying awake for hours while your mind races through catastrophic scenarios, some specific techniques help more than try to relax. Physiological relaxation through slow exhales activates your parasympathetic nervous system more directly than trying to think calm thoughts. Breathe in for 4 counts, out for 6 or 8. The extended exhale triggers a relaxation response regardless of your mental state. If your mind won't stop racing, give it a task that occupies cognitive resources without being stimulating. Count backward from 300 by 3s. For instance, the task is boring enough to not engage you fully, but demanding enough to interrupt rumination. If you've been lying awake for more than 20 minutes, get up and do something non-stimulating until you feel sleepy again. Lying in bed, not sleeping, trains your brain to associate bed with wakefulness. Your capacity during breakdown fluctuates, sometimes dramatically. You might have moments where you feel almost normal, capable of functioning and handling things, followed by crashes back into acute distress. You might have hours of complete incapacity followed by windows of relative stability. This fluctuation is normal, and expecting it helps you work with it, rather than being destabilized by it each time it happens. Good moments during breakdown are not evidence that you're over it. The relief of a good hour doesn't mean the breakdown is finished. It means you're having a good hour. Treating good moments as proof of recovery leads to overextension. You take on too much during a functional window, then crash harder when the window closes. Let good moments be good moments without building elaborate structures on top of them. Rest during them. Accomplish one or two small things if you have the capacity. Don't sign up for major commitments or make plans that assume your current state is your new baseline. Bad moments during breakdown are not evidence that you're getting worse. The despair of a particularly difficult hour doesn't mean you're losing ground. It means you're having a difficult hour. Emotional intensity fluctuates. Some of your worst moments might come several days into your breakdown, not at the beginning. This doesn't mean you're deteriorating. The breakdown isn't linear, and expecting it to be causes unnecessary alarm when you hit a low point you thought you'd passed. Tracking your fluctuations helps in two ways. First, it provides data about your actual trajectory. Your impression of how you're doing is filtered through your current state when you're in a low moment. You tend to remember only other low moments and conclude you're stuck. When you're in a better moment, you might forget how bad things were. Simple tracking a number from 1 to 10 once or twice a day, jotted in your phone, gives you objective information about your pattern. Second, tracking helps you identify what correlates with better or worse moments. You might notice that you tend to crash in late afternoon, suggesting a blood sugar or energy component. You might notice that certain interactions reliably make things worse. This information helps you structure your days around your actual patterns. Getting through the acute phase of a breakdown is not about fixing anything, achieving any particular state, or reaching any destination. Right now, your only job is survival with minimum additional damage. Get through today. Handle what absolutely must be handled. Let everything else wait. Meet your minimal structure goals if you can. Forgive yourself when you can't. Allow support from people who can give it helpfully. Protect yourself from people and situations that make things worse. Feel what needs to be felt without recirculating and wallowing. Keep your body minimally supported. The breakdown will run its course. This phase will end. The intensity that feels permanent right now is temporary, even though nothing in your current experience suggests that. The work of transformation happens later, converting this crisis into fuel for change, deciding what to rebuild and what to leave fallen, becoming who you're becoming through this experience. That work requires a version of you who has more capacity than you have right now, and pushing for that work prematurely just extends the acute phase. You're not failing by being in this state. You're not broken beyond repair. You haven't ruined everything, even if it feels that way. The sense that things will never be okay again is a feature of breakdowns, not an accurate assessment of your future. Your job right now is smaller than it's ever been. Survive this period, maintain minimum viable function, avoid making things worse, and wait for your system to stabilize enough to begin the work of what comes next. Chapter 3: Fuel from the Fire. Destruction carries energy. Enormous amounts of it. When structures collapse, whether buildings or belief systems or entire life configurations, the falling releases force that was previously bound up in maintaining what existed. This energy doesn't disappear during a breakdown. It disperses into panic, or gets consumed by shame, or exhausts itself trying to reconstruct exactly what fell apart. Most people waste this force entirely, never realizing that crisis came bearing fuel they could have used. The difference between people who emerge from breakdowns transformed and people who emerge merely damaged often comes down to a single variable: what they did with the energy their destruction released. Both groups experienced the same collapse. Both felt the same intensity. But one group let that intensity scatter in every direction, while the other captured it and pointed it somewhere useful. This isn't about being stronger or more resilient in any conventional sense. This is about recognizing that you're standing in front of an open furnace and deciding to forge something rather than just get burned. Your breakdown came with gifts you haven't unwrapped yet. Clarity you didn't have before. Motivation that fear was blocking. Permission you were never going to give yourself under normal circumstances. The chaos that feels purely destructive actually contains everything you need to build something better, if you know how to extract it before the fire dies down and you're left with nothing but ashes and the temptation to rebuild the same inadequate structure that just collapsed. Breakdowns reveal what ordinary life conceals. The daily maintenance of your normal existence requires so much attention that you rarely have bandwidth to see clearly. You're too busy managing to notice what you're managing. Too occupied with keeping things running to ask whether they should be running at all. Too focused on the immediate demands of your life to question whether that life actually fits you. Crisis strips away the maintenance demands and forces a kind of clarity that's otherwise nearly impossible to achieve. When everything falls apart, you stop pretending. You can't sustain the performances that consumed so much energy. The gap between how things looked and how things actually were becomes impossible to ignore. Truths you'd been successfully avoiding for months or years suddenly stand in plain sight, undeniable. This clarity is valuable precisely because it's rare. Under normal circumstances, your psychological defenses work smoothly to protect you from information that would require difficult changes. You don't see what's wrong because seeing would mean doing something about it. The breakdown overwhelms those defenses. The information that was being filtered out floods in. You see the relationship that's been draining you, the job that contradicts your values, the identity you've been performing that never fit, the patterns you've been repeating that lead nowhere. The problem is that crisis clarity fades. As you stabilize, as the acute intensity passes, as life starts to reconstitute itself, the defenses come back online. What was starkly obvious during the breakdown becomes fuzzy again. The truths you couldn't avoid seeing become avoidable once more. The gap between appearance and reality closes back up, and you return to normal without having captured what the crisis revealed. Capturing breakdown clarity requires deliberate effort while the clarity is still present. Write down what you're seeing. Document the truths that have become impossible to ignore. Make a record of the gap between what you were pretending and what actually is. This documentation serves you later when the defenses have reconstituted and you're tempted to doubt whether what you saw was real. The clarity was real. Your breakdown revealed something true. Capturing it in writing preserves that revelation for your future self, who will be tempted to forget. Be specific when you document. Vague acknowledgments that things need to change won't help you later. Specific observations will. Not, my job isn't working, but I've been telling myself I'm building something meaningful when actually I spend most of my time on tasks that feel pointless. And I've known this for 2 years, but didn't want to face what that would mean. Not, I haven't been taking care of myself, but I've been sleeping 5 hours a night and eating fast food for most meals and canceling every social commitment because I have nothing left after work. And I've been calling this a busy season for 18 months. The specificity is what makes the documentation useful. It captures the clarity in enough detail that you can't easily rationalize it away later. Emotions are fundamentally motivational states. Fear motivates escape or protection. Anger motivates boundary enforcement or change. Grief motivates release and reorientation. The intensity of your emotional state during breakdown is intensity that can be converted into action. Not random action. We covered the dangers of impulsive decisions during crisis. Directed action. Movement that uses the emotional force rather than just weathering it. The conversion process requires naming what you're feeling with enough precision to understand what that feeling is trying to do. Generic emotional labels like bad or upset or overwhelmed don't help here. The question is more specific. What is this emotion motivating me toward? If you're feeling rage, that rage wants something. Maybe it wants you to stop tolerating a situation that's been intolerable. Maybe it wants you to speak a truth you've been silencing. Maybe it wants you to stop accepting treatment that you never should have accepted. The rage itself isn't the answer, but it's pointing towards something that matters. What does the anger want to change? If you're feeling grief, that grief is processing loss. But grief also clears space. It acknowledges that something has ended, which is necessary before something new can begin. What is the grief releasing you from? What are you mourning? And what becomes possible once that mourning completes? If you're feeling fear, that fear is trying to protect you from something. Sometimes the fear is about legitimate dangers. Sometimes it's about changes that feel dangerous, but actually aren't. What is the fear protecting? Is that protection still serving you? Or is it keeping you stuck in something you need to leave? Understanding the motivational direction of your emotions allows you to work with them rather than just experiencing them passively. The intensity is going to be there regardless. The question is whether that intensity drives useful action or dissipates into suffering without accomplishment. This is happening to me leads to questions like, why me? What did I do to deserve this? How do I make it stop? How do I get back to how things were before? These questions have their place, but they don't lead anywhere useful. They orient you toward the past, toward restoration, toward returning to a state that may not be worth returning to. This is showing me something leads to different questions. What is this revealing that I couldn't see before? What truths have become undeniable? What has this crisis made obvious about what needs to change? What opportunities are present that weren't present before everything fell apart? These questions orient you forward. They treat the breakdown as informative rather than merely destructive. Making this shift isn't about denying the pain or pretending your breakdown is a gift. The breakdown hurts. It may have cost you things you valued. Nothing about reframing requires you to feel grateful for your suffering or minimize what you've lost. The shift is about extracting value from an experience that's going to be painful regardless. You're not choosing between suffering and learning you're suffering either way. The choice is whether you also learn. Practicing this shift involves catching yourself when you fall into victim framing and redirecting. When you notice thoughts like, I can't believe this is happening to me, or this isn't fair, or I just want things to go back to normal, recognize these as the passive framing. Then redirect with questions from the active framing. What is this showing me? What's become visible that was hidden before? What action does this situation make possible that wasn't possible before? This isn't a one-time shift. You'll drift back into passive framing repeatedly, especially during the harder moments. That's fine. The practice is noticing the drift and redirecting over and over. Each redirection strengthens the new pattern. Each time you ask, what is this showing me, instead of, why is this happening to me, you build the mental habit of active response to difficulty. The period immediately following the acute crisis phase contains a window of heightened possibility that most people miss entirely. Your normal patterns have been disrupted. The momentum of your previous life has been interrupted. The habits and routines that usually run automatically have been broken by the breakdown. This disruption, while uncomfortable, creates conditions for change that rarely exist otherwise. Under normal circumstances, changing your life is like trying to alter the course of a river. The current is strong. The channels are established. Everything flows in the direction it's always flowed, and your attempts at redirection require enormous sustained effort against constant resistance. Most attempts at change fail because the force of existing patterns is simply too strong. Breakdown disrupts these patterns. The river has flooded its banks. The old channels are submerged or destroyed. The water is going to find a new path regardless. The question is whether you participate in directing where it goes or whether you just wait for new channels to establish themselves, which may be no better than the old ones. This window doesn't last long. As you stabilize, as the acute intensity fades, patterns start reforming. If you don't intentionally create new patterns, old ones will reassert themselves by default. The opportunity to direct the flood passes, and you find yourself back in essentially the same life you had before, perhaps with some surface changes, but nothing fundamentally different. The breakdown becomes something you survived rather than something you used. Using this window requires identifying specific patterns you want to establish before the window closes. Not vague intentions to do things differently, but concrete new behaviors you're going to implement while the old behaviors are still disrupted. What time will you wake up during this rebuilding phase? How will you structure your days? What habits from your previous life are you intentionally not resuming? What new practices are you installing before the path of least resistance pulls you back to old defaults? The patterns you established during post-breakdown reconstruction become the new channels. They become the new path of least resistance once they're established. This means choices you make during this window have disproportionate long-term impact. A daily practice started during reconstruction is far more likely to stick than the same practice attempted during stable times. A habit you decline to resume during this period is far less likely to reassert itself than if you let it restart automatically. Be intentional about what you're rebuilding. Don't let default patterns reconstitute simply because you weren't paying attention. Motivation during breakdown operates differently than normal motivation, and expecting your usual sources of drive to function is a setup for disappointment. The things that previously motivated you, ambition, goals, rewards, future plans, often feel meaningless during and immediately after crisis. This isn't a character flaw or evidence that you've lost something important. It's a temporary recalibration that requires different strategies. During ordinary times, motivation often comes from pursuit, moving toward goals, achieving milestones, building toward a future vision. This pursuit motivation depends on having stable goals that feel meaningful and achievable. Breakdown typically destroys this foundation. Your previous goals may have been revealed as hollow. Your sense of the future may be too uncertain to support goal-directed behavior. The whole framework of pursuing something may feel absurd when you're not even sure who you're becoming. What remains available during this period is a different kind of motivation. Movement away from what's intolerable. You may not know what you want, but you probably know what you can't continue. You may not have a clear vision of your future, but you can identify specific elements of your past that cannot come with you. This avoidance motivation isn't inspiring in the way pursuit motivation is, but it's functional when pursuit motivation has collapsed. Use what's available. If you can't motivate yourself toward something, motivate yourself away from something. Make a list of the aspects of your previous life that your breakdown revealed as intolerable, not things you'd prefer to change, but things you absolutely cannot return to. Let the desire to avoid those things drive your choices during reconstruction. This isn't your permanent motivational structure. It's a temporary engine that keeps you moving until more inspiring fuel becomes available. The transition back to pursuit motivation happens gradually as you stabilize and begin forming a clearer picture of what you're building toward. Don't rush this transition. Don't fabricate goals just to have something to pursue. Let the avoidance motivation carry you through the reconstruction phase while your sense of direction reconstitutes itself. The clarity about what you want will come. For now, clarity about what you can't tolerate is enough. Energy during post-breakdown reconstruction is unreliable. You'll have days with surprising capacity and days where the simplest tasks feel impossible. Fighting this variability wastes resources you can't afford to waste. Working with it allows you to accomplish meaningful progress despite inconsistent availability. High-energy windows, when they occur, should be treated as valuable and finite. Don't squander them on low-priority tasks that could be handled during lower-energy times. When you feel capable, direct that capability toward the important work of reconstruction. Make decisions that need to be made. Take actions that require more capacity than you usually have. Move heavy things while you have the strength for heavy lifting. Low-energy periods require different strategies. These aren't times for important decisions or demanding tasks. They're times for maintenance, for rest, for small actions that keep things from deteriorating without requiring much from you. Have a list of low-energy tasks ready, simple things that feel manageable, even when not much feels manageable. Responding to a non-urgent message, paying a bill, tidying one's surface, reading something useful but not demanding. These tasks keep you moving without requiring resources you don't have. The mistake most people make is treating energy as something they should have rather than something they actually have. They plan their days based on imaginary consistent capacity, then judge themselves when actual capacity varies. This self-judgment consumes energy that could have gone toward actual tasks. Accept that your energy is going to be unreliable during this period. Plan for variability rather than demanding consistency. Work with what's actually available rather than what you think should be available. Tracking energy patterns helps you predict and utilize windows more effectively. You might notice that mornings are generally better than afternoons, or that certain activities drain you while others seem neutral or even restoring. You might find that your energy correlates with sleep quality, or food choices, or social interaction. This information lets you schedule strategically important tasks during predicted high-energy windows, maintenance tasks during predicted low-energy periods. Forward motion during reconstruction doesn't require confidence. Waiting until you feel confident before taking action means waiting indefinitely, because confidence returns through action, not before it. You act uncertain and incomplete, and the acting itself generates the confidence you were waiting to feel before acting. This reversal confuses people because it contradicts the intuitive sequence. Surely you should feel ready before you do something. Surely confidence precedes action. Surely you should wait until you know what you're doing before you do it. This intuitive sequence is backwards. Readiness follows action. Confidence follows action. Knowing what you're doing follows the doing of it. The sequence you're waiting for doesn't exist outside of action. Small actions taken without confidence produce small amounts of confidence. Larger actions produce more. The confidence accumulates through repeated evidence that you can act. You can handle what happens. You can adjust when things don't go as expected. None of this evidence becomes available while you're waiting to feel ready. All of it becomes available once you start moving. The practical application is to lower your threshold for action during reconstruction. Don't wait until an action feels comfortable or confidence-inspiring. Act when an action seems directionally correct, even if you're uncertain about the details. The details will clarify through the action itself. Your uncertainty isn't evidence that you should wait, it's the normal state before you've acted. And it only resolves after you do. This doesn't mean acting recklessly or ignoring genuine concerns. The distinction is between uncertainty about how things will unfold versus clear signals that something is wrong. Uncertainty about unforeseeable outcomes is not a reason to delay. Clear signals of problems are worth attending to. Learn to tell the difference. "I'm not sure how this will go" is not the same as "this seems like a bad idea." The first is normal and shouldn't stop you. The second might be worth pausing over. Converting destruction into direction requires sustained attention over time, not a single dramatic decision. The transformation happens through accumulated small choices made consistently over days and weeks. Each choice either reinforces the changes your breakdown revealed as necessary or slides back toward patterns that needed to fall. The temptation is to treat reconstruction as an event rather than a process. You make some declarations about how things will be different. You implement some changes in a burst of post-crisis energy. Then you return to not thinking much about it, assuming the changes are installed and will persist automatically. They won't. The old patterns will reassert themselves unless you keep choosing the new patterns until they become automatic themselves. Daily recommitment sounds tedious, and it is. Every morning, or at whatever time you choose to set intentions for your day, remind yourself what you're building and what you're refusing to return to. This isn't motivational self-talk or empty affirmation. It's practical redirection of attention toward the choices that matter. What patterns am I reinforcing today? What opportunities to slide backward am I watching for? What specific actions am I taking that align with what my breakdown revealed? Missing days happens. Sliding backward happens. These lapses are not evidence that you've failed or that change is impossible for you. They're normal parts of the process, expected setbacks within an overall trajectory of change. Notice the lapse, recommit, continue. Don't convert a single missed day into an excuse to abandon the entire project. Don't interpret a temporary slide backward as proof that you're incapable of moving forward. Catch the slip and redirect. The fire from your breakdown is still burning, but it won't burn forever. The intensity that feels overwhelming right now is also the energy that makes rapid change possible. What you do with this period, whether you capture the clarity before it fades, direct the emotional intensity toward useful action, establish new patterns before old ones reassert, and maintain daily recommitment through the reconstruction process determines whether your breakdown becomes a turning point or just a painful interruption in an unchanged life. Everything you need is already present. The motivation is available if you're willing to use avoidance as fuel until pursuit motivation returns. The energy is available in the fluctuating windows between depletion. The clarity is available as long as you capture it before your defenses reconstitute. The opportunity is available while the old patterns remain disrupted and new ones haven't yet solidified. What happens next depends on whether you treat this period as something to survive or something to use. The burning is going to happen regardless. The only question is whether anything gets forged in it. Chapter 4: Building something new from what remains. The most dangerous moment comes after the falling stops. Not during the breakdown itself. That period has its own obvious challenges, and you knew enough to treat it carefully. The dangerous moment arrives once you've stabilized, once the acute crisis has passed, once you have enough energy to start rebuilding. Because this is when nearly everyone makes the same catastrophic mistake. They try to reconstruct exactly what they had before. And this is precisely how people waste their breakdowns entirely. They survive the demolition, then rebuild the same inadequate structure on the same unstable foundation, setting themselves up for the same collapse somewhere down the road. The breakdown produced nothing except suffering and delay. Everything they went through taught them nothing because they refused to let it change anything. If you've picked up this book, you probably know people who've done this. Perhaps you've done it yourself in previous crises. The pattern is so common it almost seems inevitable. It isn't, but escaping it requires understanding why. Getting back to normal is often the wrong goal entirely. Normal was the problem. This statement sounds obvious when written plainly, but most people resist its implications with everything they have. If normal was the problem, then you can't solve the problem by restoring normal. If the structure that collapsed needed to collapse, then rebuilding that structure doesn't represent recovery. It represents refusing to learn what the collapse was trying to teach you. Your breakdown didn't happen randomly. It happened because something wasn't working. Maybe many things weren't working. The specific configuration of your life, your job, your habits, your commitments, your ways of relating to yourself and others, your priorities and patterns, that configuration produced unsustainable pressure until something gave. The collapse was the result, not the cause. Going back to the same configuration restarts the same process that led to collapse in the first place. This doesn't mean everything in your previous life was wrong, or that you need to burn it all down and start from nothing. Most breakdowns don't require total reconstruction. They require selective reconstruction, keeping what worked, releasing what didn't, and building new structures that reflect what the crisis revealed. The challenge is distinguishing between these categories with enough honesty to actually make different choices. People resist this distinction because it requires acknowledging uncomfortable truth. That job you're eager to return to might be one of the things that needs to stay fallen. That identity you've been maintaining might need permanent revision. That version of yourself you're trying to recover might be exactly what you need to leave behind. These acknowledgments are painful. They require grieving what you're not going back to. They demand accepting that some of what you lost was worth losing, even though the losing hurt. Distinguishing between structures worth rebuilding and structures that needed to collapse permanently requires a specific kind of honesty that most people avoid. The question isn't whether something was good or bad in some abstract sense. The question is whether that particular element of your life was contributing to or protecting against the pressure that caused your breakdown. Some answers will be clear. That habit of working until midnight every night was obviously adding pressure. That commitment you made out of obligation, rather than genuine desire, was clearly draining, rather than fulfilling. These clear cases are easy to identify as structures that needed to fall and should stay fallen. Other answers will be more complicated. Your job might have been both meaningful and unsustainable. You loved the work, but the conditions were destroying you. Your social life might have included some relationships that nourished you and others that depleted you, all mixed together. These mixed cases require more careful examination. The question becomes, can this be rebuilt in a way that preserves what worked while eliminating what didn't? Or is the problematic element so fundamental that the whole structure needs to stay down? The trickiest cases are the ones where something felt good, but was actually part of the problem. That constant busyness that made you feel productive and important might have been preventing you from facing things that needed facing. That identity as someone who handles everything might have been driving you to take on more than any person could sustain. That habit of putting everyone else first might have felt virtuous, while slowly destroying your capacity to function. These cases require the deepest honesty, because you have to acknowledge that something you valued was actually harming you. The pull toward complete restoration operates through several mechanisms worth understanding, because understanding them helps you resist. Familiarity bias makes the known feel safer than the unknown, even when the known was actively harmful. You know how your old life worked. You knew your role, your routines, your relationships. The idea of building something different triggers uncertainty that your nervous system reads as threat. Going back feels like going home, even if home was on fire. Social pressure pushes toward restoration because the people around you were adapted to your previous configuration. Your employer wants you back at full function. Your family wants the old you to return. Your friends want things to go back to how they were. These expectations aren't malicious. The people in your life genuinely believe that your recovery means returning to normal. But their belief doesn't make it true, and their pressure can push you toward reconstruction that repeats rather than repairs. Identity investment makes releasing parts of your previous life feel like losing yourself. If you identified strongly with your career and your breakdown revealed that career as unsustainable, releasing it feels like releasing part of who you are. If you saw yourself as someone who could handle anything and your breakdown proved that false, accepting a different self-concept feels like admitting defeat. The investment you've made in being a particular kind of person makes it intensely difficult to become a different kind of person, even when the change would serve you. Sunk cost reasoning tells you that you can't let all that effort be wasted. You spent years building that career, that relationship, that identity. Walking away feels like throwing away everything you invested. This reasoning ignores the reality that continuing to invest in something broken doesn't recover past investment. It just adds future loss to past loss. The years are already spent. The question is what you do with the years still available. Recognizing these mechanisms when they operate helps you distinguish between genuine reasons to rebuild something and psychological pressure to restore what's familiar regardless of whether it serves you. Making decisions about what to restore, what to leave fallen, and what to build differently requires a framework that cuts through emotional attachment and social pressure. The following questions help with this evaluation. What was this element's relationship to the pressure that caused my breakdown? Direct contributors to unsustainable pressure should stay fallen or be rebuilt radically differently. Neutral elements can be restored if you want them. Elements that were actually protective can be prioritized for rebuilding. What would I choose if I were starting from scratch with no history? Temporarily remove the weight of past investment and social expectation. If you knew nothing about your previous life and were designing a new one, would this element be part of it? If yes, rebuild it. If no, the only reason to restore it is momentum, and momentum isn't a good enough reason. What does my post-breakdown clarity say about this element? The crisis revealed truths that were hidden before. What did it reveal about this particular component of your life? If the breakdown showed you that something wasn't working, believe what you saw. Don't let returning stability convince you that the clarity was wrong. What would rebuilding this cost me? And what would it cost me to leave it fallen? Both choices have prices. Rebuilding something that needs to stay down costs continued pressure and potential future breakdown. Leaving something fallen that should be rebuilt costs whatever that element was providing. Compare the costs honestly. Neither choice is free, but one choice is usually less expensive than the other. Can this be rebuilt in a genuinely different way? Or would rebuilding necessarily recreate the same problems? Some structures can be redesigned. A career can be pursued in a different role or different organization. A pattern can be modified to remove its harmful elements. But some structures carry their problems inherently. If the problems were fundamental rather than incidental, rebuilding creates the same issues regardless of how carefully you approach it. Letting go of what needs to stay fallen requires grieving, and most people try to skip this part. The pressure to move forward, to be productive with your reconstruction, to not wallow in the past, all of this pressure pushes you away from the grief work that actually allows clean release. You end up carrying unresolved attachment to things you've theoretically let go of, and that attachment pulls you backward even as you try to move forward. Grief for what your breakdown revealed you need to release doesn't follow a predictable timeline. You might feel the loss intensely at first, and then barely at all. You might feel fine for weeks, and then get hit with a wave of mourning for the life you're not going back to. You might grieve different elements at different times, the identity loss hitting first. Then the relationship changes, then the daily routine alterations. None of this is wrong. It's just how loss gets processed. The practical work of grieving involves allowing the feelings associated with release without trying to fix or rush them. When sadness about what you're not rebuilding arises, let it be present without arguing with it or pushing it away. When anger about having to make these changes emerges, let that be present too. When fear about what building something new might require comes up, acknowledge it without letting it drive you back toward false restoration. This doesn't mean endless rumination on loss. The grief work has a function, processing attachment to what's being released, so that attachment doesn't continue controlling your choices. Functional grief moves through. It arises, is felt, and eventually completes. If you're circling the same loss endlessly without any movement, something is stuck. But if waves of grief arise and pass while you continue building forward, that's the process working correctly. Building new structures that reflect who you're becoming, rather than who you were, requires a fundamental shift in orientation. Most life building is backward looking. What have I done before? What am I qualified for? What do people expect of me? What continuation makes sense given my history? Post-breakdown building needs to be forward-looking. What am I actually drawn toward? What would fit the person I'm becoming? What serves my actual values rather than my historical patterns? This reorientation feels disorienting because you're used to constructing your future from the materials of your past. You choose work based on your resume. You make commitments based on your established role. You build identity from accumulated history. Suddenly trying to build from some less defined sense of what you're moving toward can feel groundless, like constructing without a foundation. The foundation exists, it's just different. Instead of building from historical identity and external expectation, you're building from internal signals and emergent direction. What do you actually care about when you strip away what you're supposed to care about? What feels genuinely engaging rather than merely impressive? What kind of days would you want to have if you weren't performing for anyone? What would you build if you knew the people in your life would adjust to whatever you chose? These questions reveal a different foundation than the one you were building on before. This foundation is harder to articulate, less externally validated, more personally meaningful. It requires trusting your own direction rather than following established paths. It demands that you take your own desires and values seriously as legitimate guides for building a life. Practical reconstruction happens in 3 layers that build on each other: essential function, sustainable structure, and aligned expression. Trying to build all 3 simultaneously leads to overwhelm and confusion. Working through them sequentially creates solid ground for each subsequent layer. Essential function means the minimum viable life basic needs met, unavoidable responsibilities handled, nothing actively deteriorating. If your breakdown disrupted your ability to pay rent or feed yourself or maintain basic health, essential function is where you start. This layer isn't inspiring, and it isn't supposed to be. It's just the foundation that allows anything else to be built. Don't try to design your ideal life while essential function is still unstable. Once essential function is solid, sustainable structure becomes the focus. This layer addresses how you're going to live day to day in ways you can actually maintain. Work arrangements that don't deplete you, routines that support rather than drain, commitments you can honor without overextending. The key word is sustainable, not optimal, not impressive, not maximal, but sustainable. Structures you could maintain indefinitely without accumulating the kind of pressure that caused your breakdown. Sustainable structure requires honest assessment of your actual capacity. Not what you could do in a burst of crisis energy. Not what you could sustain for a few weeks before crashing. What you can actually maintain over months and years while staying healthy. Most people overestimate this capacity, especially if they're coming from a breakdown caused partly by overcommitment. Build structures that feel slightly too easy. You can always add more later. You can't easily recover from another collapse caused by rebuilding too ambitiously. After sustainable structure is established and tested, aligned expression becomes possible. This layer is about living in ways that actually reflect your values, pursue what genuinely matters to you, and express who you're becoming. This is where the interesting reconstruction happens, but it only happens solidly if the previous layers are stable. Trying to pursue aligned expression while essential function is shaky or sustainable structure hasn't been established leads to building on sand. The components you're choosing to rebuild need to be rebuilt intentionally rather than automatically. Default reconstruction recreates previous patterns because those patterns are most available and require least thought. Intentional reconstruction examines each element before allowing it to take shape. Work reconstruction, if you're rebuilding your work life, involves asking questions that go deeper than "How do I get my old job back?" or "What similar job should I pursue?" Questions like, what kinds of tasks do I find genuinely engaging versus merely tolerable? What work environments support my functioning versus drain it? What level of intensity and pressure is sustainable for me specifically, not theoretically? What would I need to believe about work for my relationship with it to be healthy? These questions might lead back to something similar to what you had before, or they might reveal that significant change is needed. Routine reconstruction examines the daily and weekly patterns that structure how you live. The times you wake and sleep, the way you handle meals, movement, rest, the rhythms of effort and recovery. Your old routines were part of the configuration that led to breakdown. Rebuilding them without examination recreates conditions that failed you before. What would routines look like if sustainability mattered more than productivity? What would your days look like if you actually rested when you needed rest rather than pushing through? What would your weeks look like if recovery time was treated as essential rather than optional? Commitment reconstruction looks at what you've agreed to do and for whom. Many people's breakdowns trace directly to overcommitment, too many obligations, too many people depending on them, too many promises that couldn't all be kept without destroying themselves in the process. Rebuilding your commitment structure requires asking, what am I actually willing to do? Not what I should do, not what people expect, not what would make me a good person by some external standard. What am I genuinely willing to commit to? This question often reveals that many previous commitments were made from obligation or guilt or inability to say no rather than genuine willingness. Identity reconstruction addresses how you see yourself and how you present yourself to others. Your breakdown may have revealed that some aspects of your self-concept were unsustainable performances rather than authentic expressions. The identity of someone who handles everything. The identity of someone who never needs help. The identity of someone whose value comes from constant achievement. These identities exact costs that become clear during crisis. Rebuilding identity means asking, who am I actually when I'm not performing? What aspects of my previous self-concept were authentic expressions versus exhausting roles I felt required to play? The fear that you're using your breakdown as an excuse to avoid hard things deserves attention, because it will arise and it will create doubt. This fear asks, am I being honest about what needs to change, or am I using my crisis as justification for giving up on things that are simply difficult? The question is legitimate, and dismissing it entirely isn't wise. The distinction between things that need to change and things you're avoiding because they're hard isn't always obvious, but some markers help. Things that need to change tend to be associated with the pressure that caused your breakdown. They were part of the problem, and rebuilding them would recreate the problem. Things you're avoiding because they're hard tend to be disconnected from your breakdown. They weren't causing the pressure. You just don't want to do them, and the crisis provides convenient cover for opting out. If your breakdown was caused partly by an unsustainable work situation, and you're now considering not returning to that situation, that's not excuse-making, that's appropriate learning from what happened. If your breakdown was caused by something unrelated to your work, and you're now using it as a reason to avoid professional challenges that were fine before, that might be avoidance masquerading as wisdom. The quality of your reasoning matters here. When you're being honest about necessary change, you can articulate clearly why that element contributed to your breakdown, and why rebuilding it differently is appropriate. When you're using your crisis as an excuse, the connection between the thing you're avoiding and the breakdown tends to be vague or constructed after the fact. This was clearly part of what was destroying me sounds different from, well, everything was too much, so I'm just not doing this anymore. Some genuine gray areas exist where legitimate change and convenient avoidance mix together. You might need to leave your current job legitimate, and also be using that need as an excuse to avoid job searching avoidance. You might need to reduce commitments legitimate, and also be avoiding specific obligations you never wanted to honor anyway avoidance. Being honest with yourself means acknowledging both elements rather than pretending the avoidance doesn't exist, just because the legitimate need also exists. Testing new structures before fully committing to them prevents the mistake of exchanging one unsustainable configuration for another. The clarity your breakdown provided was real, but your judgment about what to build instead might still be skewed by crisis effects, limited information, or incomplete recovery. Testing allows you to discover whether your proposed new structures actually work before you're fully dependent on them. Testing means implementing changes provisionally at first. If you're considering a major career change, explore it through smaller experiments before quitting your job. Informational conversations, side projects, volunteer work in the new direction. If you're planning to restructure your daily routines, try the new patterns for a few weeks before assuming they're your permanent approach. If you're considering ending commitments, reduce involvement before complete withdrawal to see what that reduction actually feels like. This provisional approach serves several functions. You gather information about whether the proposed change actually delivers what you're hoping for. You discover unforeseen problems while the stakes are still low. You give yourself permission to adjust based on what you learn, rather than feeling locked into whatever you initially decided. You avoid the common pattern of dramatic post-breakdown decisions followed by regret when the changes don't work as expected. Testing requires accepting that you don't have everything figured out yet. The certainty that often accompanies post-breakdown clarity can make testing feel unnecessary. You know what you need to do, so why not just do it? Because that certainty is partly an artifact of your crisis state, rather than fully reliable wisdom. The outlines of what you learned are probably accurate. The specifics of how to implement those learnings benefit from experimentation. Support during reconstruction looks different than support during breakdown. The acute crisis required people who could simply be present with you in your distress. Reconstruction requires people who can help you build, rather than just hold you while you fall. The skills are different, and the people who provided excellent crisis support might not be the same people who provide excellent building support. Building support involves people who can reflect back what they see you doing, ask questions that sharpen your thinking, offer perspectives you might be missing, and hold you accountable to intentions you've expressed. These people help you think more clearly about reconstruction decisions without telling you what to do. They're curious about your reasoning without being judgmental. They can challenge your plans without undermining your confidence. Not everyone in your life can provide this kind of support. Some people are too invested in your previous configuration. They want you back to normal because your change is uncomfortable for them. Some people are too eager to direct your reconstruction. They have opinions about what you should do, and will push those opinions rather than supporting your own process. Some people are simply not equipped for this kind of conversation. They care about you, but don't have the capacity to engage with complex rebuilding questions. Identify who in your life might serve as building support and engage them intentionally. Tell them what you're working through. Ask for their observations and questions rather than their advice. Use conversations with them to clarify your own thinking. This is different from processing emotions or seeking reassurance. It's thinking out loud with someone who can help you think better. Professional support might be appropriate during this phase as well. Therapists, coaches, mentors, and other professionals bring skills that friends and family typically don't have. They're not invested in your previous configuration. They're trained to ask questions that generate insight. They can see patterns you might miss because you're too close to your own situation. The cost of professional support is worth considering as an investment in getting reconstruction right, rather than having to do it again later. Rebuilding after breakdown takes longer than most people expect. The acute crisis had intensity, but relatively short duration. Reconstruction lacks that intensity, but extends over months, sometimes years. The gap between surviving the breakdown and having a stable new life configuration can feel endless, and the slow pace creates its own challenges. Impatience during reconstruction leads to shortcuts that undermine the process. You get tired of the careful, provisional, testing-based approach and just want things to be settled. You commit to structures before they've been adequately tested. You skip the grief work because it's taking too long. You declare yourself rebuilt before the building is actually complete. These shortcuts feel like progress, but often create new problems or set up future collapses. Managing the pace of reconstruction requires accepting that solid building takes time you can't compress. Some processes genuinely cannot be rushed. Grief completes on its own timeline. New patterns become stable through repetition over weeks and months. Understanding of what you're building clarifies gradually through experience. Trying to force these processes to move faster doesn't speed them up, it just makes them incomplete. Marking progress helps you tolerate the slow pace. Keep a record of where you started and where you are now. Note the structures you've successfully established, the patterns you've changed, the growth that's occurred. When reconstruction feels endless, reviewing this record reminds you that things have changed, that you're not stuck, that movement is happening, even when it feels imperceptible. Your rebuilt life won't look like your old life, and that's supposed to be the point. If you're doing this well, what emerges from reconstruction reflects the lessons your breakdown taught, incorporates the clarity your crisis provided, and addresses the pressures that caused the collapse. The new configuration should be recognizably different from the old one, not different in every respect, but different in the respects that matter. This difference will feel strange at first. You'll have moments of disorientation when you realize how much has changed. You might miss aspects of your old life, even if you know they were part of the problem. You might feel uncertain about whether the new configuration is right, whether you've made good choices, whether you should have fought harder to restore what you had. This uncertainty is normal. It doesn't mean you've done something wrong. The test of your reconstruction isn't whether it feels perfect or comfortable. The test is whether it's sustainable and whether it fits who you're becoming rather than who you used to be. These tests take time to answer. The sustainability of your new structures only becomes clear after you've lived with them for a while. The fit with who you're becoming only becomes clear as you continue becoming. Trust what you learned in the fire. Build from the ruins with intention. Let what needed to fall stay fallen, and construct what comes next with the wisdom that only collapse could have taught you. Chapter 5: Who You Become After. You cannot go back. This statement sounds like encouragement, a motivational push toward your bright new future. It isn't. It's a simple description of reality that carries both liberation and grief. The person you were before your breakdown no longer exists. That version of you was dismantled along with the structures that collapsed. You can no more return to being that person than a caterpillar can crawl back into its cocoon and unbecome the butterfly. The transformation has occurred. What remains is learning to live as whoever you are now. Most people don't fully register this until they try to return to normal and find that normal no longer fits. They've changed, but they haven't yet recognized the extent of the change. They attempt to resume their previous life and discover that the person attempting the resumption isn't the person who lived that life before. The job feels different. The relationships feel different. The daily patterns that used to be automatic now require conscious choice. Something fundamental has shifted, and no amount of trying to ignore that shift makes it reverse. This irreversibility frightens people. They want the option to go back if the new configuration doesn't work out. They want to know that the familiar version of themselves is still available as a fallback. Discovering that the fallback doesn't exist can trigger another crisis on top of the original one: grief for a self that's gone, panic about who they're supposed to be now, disorientation in a life that looks the same but feels entirely foreign. Understanding that this irreversibility is normal, expected, and actually necessary for genuine transformation helps. You're not losing your mind. You're just experiencing what happens after breakdown completes its work. The identity shift that follows breakdown doesn't arrive all at once. It reveals itself gradually through accumulating evidence that you're not who you used to be. Small moments pile up. You react differently to situations that used to trigger you. You want different things than you wanted before. Priorities that seemed essential now seem arbitrary, while things you used to ignore now demand attention. You catch yourself thinking thoughts that wouldn't have occurred to your previous self. You make choices your former version would have found confusing or even alarming. This accumulation can feel unsettling when you're not prepared for it. Each small evidence of change raises the question: who am I becoming? The question doesn't have a clean answer because you're still in the process of becoming. You're not yet the person you'll be, but you're no longer the person you were. This in-between state is uncomfortable precisely because humans prefer defined identity over fluid uncertainty. You want to know who you are. The breakdown has temporarily made that knowing impossible. Sitting with the uncertainty, rather than forcing premature definition, serves the process better than rushing to declare a new identity. The temptation will be to replace your old self-concept with a new one quickly, to decide who you are now and commit to that decision. This rush usually produces an identity that's reactive rather than authentic. You define yourself in opposition to who you used to be, rather than discovering who you're actually becoming. I used to be someone who overworked, so now I'm someone who prioritizes balance. This definition might be accurate, or it might just be the first available alternative to what you were before. Give the new identity time to emerge, rather than constructing it deliberately. Pay attention to what draws you, what repels you, what feels genuine, and what feels performed. Notice which aspects of the new you feel stable, and which feel like experiments that might not last. This noticing, accumulated over weeks and months, reveals who you're becoming more reliably than any deliberate identity construction could. Integrating your breakdown experience into your self-concept requires finding a way to hold what happened that neither minimizes it nor makes it your entire story. Both extremes create problems. Minimizing the breakdown, treating it as a temporary glitch, an aberration that's now over, something that happened but doesn't really define anything, loses the lessons and sets up potential repetition. Making the breakdown your whole identity, defining yourself primarily as someone who had a breakdown. Organizing your self-concept around the crisis. Letting it become the main thing about you limits who you can become and traps you in a narrative that's no longer serving you. The integration that works acknowledges the breakdown as significant without making it central. Something important happened. You went through something that changed you. That experience is part of your history and informs who you are now. And also, that experience isn't the most important thing about you. It's a chapter, not the whole book. It shaped you, but it doesn't define you. You're more than someone who had a breakdown and survived it. This balanced integration takes time to achieve. Initially, the breakdown dominates your self-concept because it's recent and intense. Everything gets viewed through the lens of the crisis. You're always the person who just went through that thing. Every interaction colored by that recent history. This phase is normal and passes. As time accumulates after the breakdown, as new experiences layer on top of the crisis, as you develop more post-breakdown history, the breakdown naturally assumes a smaller portion of your total self-concept. You can support this integration process by consciously developing other aspects of identity alongside processing the breakdown experience. Pursue interests that have nothing to do with your crisis. Build relationships where the breakdown isn't the main topic of conversation. Accomplish things that prove you're more than your worst period. This isn't denial or avoidance. You're not pretending the breakdown didn't happen. You're building a fuller identity that contains the breakdown experience without being consumed by it. The clarity and priority shifts your crisis created will fade if you don't actively maintain them. This fading is not a failure or a regression. It's the natural result of how human psychology works. Intensity creates temporary clarity. The extreme pressure of breakdown cuts through confusion and reveals what matters with unusual precision. When the intensity passes, that unusual precision softens back toward baseline. The insight that felt undeniable during crisis starts feeling more optional. The priority that seemed absolutely clear starts competing with other priorities again. If you want to preserve what you learned during breakdown, you need practices that keep those lessons alive after the crisis energy dissipates. You need to institutionalize your insights, rather than relying on their felt intensity to maintain them. Writing serves this function well. Document what the breakdown revealed to you, while the revelations still feel vivid. Capture the truths that became undeniable, the priorities that emerged, the commitments you made to yourself about what would be different. Be specific. Be detailed. Write as if you're leaving a message for your future self, who will have partially forgotten what this experience taught. Because that future self will partially forget. The document you create becomes a retrieval system for insights that would otherwise fade. Regular review of what you documented keeps the lessons present. weekly or monthly, depending on how recently your breakdown occurred. Return to what you wrote. Not to wallow in the crisis, but to reconnect with the clarity it produced. Does your current life align with what you said mattered during the breakdown? Have you drifted from the priorities that seemed non-negotiable? Are you honoring the commitments you made, or has the pull of normalcy eroded them? This review catches drift early, before small deviations accumulate into complete departure from what you learned. Conversations with trusted people serve a similar function. Share your breakthrough insights with someone who can reflect them back to you. Give them permission to ask whether you're living consistently with what you said you learned. This external accountability supplements your internal review, catching blind spots that self-assessment misses. The pull back toward old patterns operates constantly, automatically, and mostly unconsciously. You don't decide to abandon what you learned during breakdown. You just gradually drift in that direction through 1,000 small choices, each one seemingly insignificant, that collectively return you to where you started. The mechanism is simple. Old patterns require less energy than new ones. Your previous way of living, however unsustainable it proved to be, was at least familiar. Your nervous system had adapted to it. The neural pathways were established. Operating that way felt natural, even when it was destroying you. New patterns, however healthy, require conscious effort. They demand attention. They feel unfamiliar. Every day you have to choose them over the default alternative that would require nothing. This energy differential explains why people fall back into old patterns despite knowing better. It's not that they've forgotten what they learned. It's that maintaining new patterns costs something that old patterns don't cost. When you're tired, stressed, or depleted, the energy required for new patterns becomes harder to muster. Default patterns reassert themselves in exactly these moments because defaults don't require mustering anything. Recognizing this mechanism helps you design around it. Expect the pull backward. Plan for it. When you notice yourself drifting toward old patterns, that's not evidence that you've failed or that change is impossible. It's evidence that you're human, and that old patterns have gravitational force. The question isn't whether you'll feel pulled backward, you will, repeatedly. The question is what you do when you notice the pull. Catching the drift early makes correction easier. Small deviations from new patterns are easy to correct. Large deviations take much more effort. Pay attention to the early signs. The small compromise that seems harmless. The exception that's just this once. The gradual relaxation of boundaries you established. These early signs predict further drift if unaddressed. Address them when they're small rather than waiting until they've accumulated into significant regression. Building practices that continue growth without requiring crisis means creating systems for the kind of development that breakdown forced upon you. The crisis created conditions for change that don't exist during ordinary life. Disrupted patterns, unavoidable truths, clarity about what matters. Without crisis, these conditions have to be generated deliberately. Scheduled reflection creates artificial pressure to examine what you're doing and how you're living. Most people never stop to assess whether their current trajectory serves them, because nothing forces the assessment. Life flows forward automatically, one day into the next, without built-in pause points for evaluation. Building in regular reflection weekly, monthly, quarterly creates the pause that crisis forced involuntarily. These reflections don't need to be elaborate. 10 minutes asking yourself, what's working, what isn't, what needs to change, provides the examination that breakdown demanded under more extreme circumstances. Difficult conversations that you'd naturally avoid create some of the truth, forcing that breakdown provided. During crisis, you couldn't hide from truths about your life, because the collapse stripped away your capacity for denial. During ordinary life, that capacity for denial functions smoothly. You avoid uncomfortable realizations. You don't ask questions whose answers might require change. Deliberately initiating conversations that surface uncomfortable truths with yourself in writing, with trusted others who will be honest. with professionals trained to ask hard questions replaces what breakdown did through force. Intentional discomfort keeps you from settling into patterns so comfortable that they become invisible. This doesn't mean manufacturing crisis or seeking out suffering. It means maintaining activities that challenge you, that require growth, that put you in situations where you can't coast on autopilot. Physical challenges, skill development, projects that push your capacity, relationships that ask something of you. This intentional discomfort prevents the calcification that often sets in after people stabilize from breakdown, the sense that they've done enough growth for one lifetime and can now settle into permanent comfort. Staying connected to your breakthrough insights during ordinary days is harder than it sounds, because ordinary days work against that connection. The mundane has a way of asserting itself over the meaningful. Bills need paying, meals need making, emails need answering. The urgent persistently crowds out the important. Before you know it, weeks have passed without any contact with the truths your breakdown revealed, and those truths have become abstractions rather than lived guidance. Physical anchors help maintain connection. Objects that represent what you learned become touchstones that recall your breakthrough without requiring deliberate effort. Maybe a piece of jewelry you bought after the breakdown, worn daily, that reminds you every time you notice it. Maybe something on your desk that catches your eye and recalls why you arranged your work life differently. Maybe a photo, a note, a book, any physical object that triggers association with the insights you want to preserve. These anchors work because they don't require you to remember. They prompt you automatically through the simple fact of being present in your environment. Ritual practices create recurring contact with breakthrough meaning. A morning practice that includes acknowledging what matters to you now. An evening practice that includes brief assessment of whether you live today consistently with what you learned. Weekly time set aside for deeper reconnection with your post-breakdown commitments. These rituals don't need to be long or elaborate. Brevity helps with consistency. They just need to happen regularly enough that the connection is maintained rather than allowed to dissolve. The people you've told about your breakthrough can serve as living reminders. They know what you went through. They know what you said it taught you. Spending time with these people naturally brings the lessons closer to the surface. Conversations with them tend to touch on what you learned, because that's part of your shared context. Maintaining these relationships maintains proximity to your breakthrough insights without requiring you to do anything special. The fear that you'll eventually require another breakdown to maintain growth haunts many people after crisis. They worry that the transformation depends on the intensity, that without extreme pressure, they'll inevitably drift backward. That breakdown will become a recurring feature of their life, because it's the only thing that works. This fear makes sense given the experience of how powerful crisis-driven change can be compared to ordinary attempts at growth. The fear is partially founded and partially not. Yes, breakdown creates conditions for change that ordinary life doesn't provide naturally. Yes, without deliberate practices that recreate some of those conditions, drift backward is likely. Yes, some people do cycle through repeated breakdowns because they never build the systems that sustain growth without crisis. No, breakdown is not the only way to grow. No, you're not doomed to repeated collapse just because collapse was effective once. No, the intensity isn't what made the change possible. The intensity just forced certain things that can also be achieved through deliberate practice. What breakdown forced was confrontation with truth, disruption of automatic patterns, and prioritization of what actually matters. These can be achieved without crisis. Deliberate practices that surface uncomfortable truths replace the truth forcing of breakdown. Intentional pattern disruption travel, new challenges, changed routines replaces the disruption that crisis imposed. Regular reflection on priorities replaces the mandatory prioritization that happens when everything falls apart. None of these deliberate approaches are as powerful as breakdown. None of them will feel as intense or produce as dramatic results. But they're sustainable. They can be maintained indefinitely. And maintained over time. They accumulate impact that rivals what crisis achieved in a single overwhelming experience. The goal isn't to never have another breakdown. Life may deliver circumstances that overwhelm regardless of how well you've set things up. The goal is to not require breakdown for growth. The goal is to continue developing during ordinary times so that crisis isn't the only engine of transformation. Sharing what you learned creates accountability and contribution simultaneously. When you tell others about your breakdown and what it taught you, you commit publicly to the lessons you're claiming to have learned. That commitment makes drift harder because you'd be contradicting your own stated wisdom. You've told people what you know now. Living inconsistently with that knowledge becomes embarrassing in a way that living inconsistently with private insights isn't. Sharing also contributes to others who might benefit. Your experience, however personal it feels, isn't unique. Other people are going through similar crises. Other people are emerging from breakdown, wondering how to make the transformation stick. Your willingness to talk about what you went through and what you learned from it might provide exactly what someone else needs to hear. The sharing doesn't require public declaration or elaborate storytelling. It might mean being honest with friends about a difficult period when they ask how you've been. It might mean mentioning to a colleague that you've been through some things that changed your priorities. It might mean writing in a journal that someone could read someday, or contributing to a community of people dealing with similar issues, or simply being available to listen when others go through their own crises. Sharing needs to be appropriate to context and timing. Not everyone wants to hear about your breakdown. Not every situation calls for disclosure. Sharing indiscriminately can be as problematic as refusing to share at all. It can become a way of performing transformation rather than actually living it. Or it can burden people with more information than they signed up to receive. The sharing that serves you and others is selective, appropriate, and offered as contribution rather than demanded as attention. Living as the person you've become rather than performing recovery creates a distinction worth understanding. Performing recovery means constantly referencing your breakdown, explaining your choices through the lens of the crisis, treating your transformation as an identity to maintain rather than a natural state to inhabit. Living as who you've become means simply being the person the breakdown produced without ongoing emphasis on the transformation process. The difference is subtle but significant. When you're performing recovery, every choice comes with internal or external explanation. I'm setting this boundary because I learned during my breakdown that boundaries matter. I'm leaving work on time because my crisis taught me that overwork was destroying me. I'm saying no to this commitment because I've learned to protect my capacity. This constant referencing keeps the breakdown central, makes every choice about the crisis, and creates a kind of fragile identity built on transformation as accomplishment. When you're simply living as who you've become, the breakdown recedes into background. You set boundaries because that's what you do now. You leave work on time because that's your pattern. You say no to commitments because you're someone who protects your capacity. The breakdown is in your history, informing these behaviors, but it's not in your present narration of every choice. You're not recovering anymore. You're just living. This transition happens naturally over time as the breakdown becomes less recent. But you can support it by gradually reducing the extent to which you explain your choices through the lens of crisis. Start letting your choices stand on their own. Start being who you are now without constantly referencing who you were before or why you changed. The transformation was real. The lessons were learned. You don't have to keep retelling the story to yourself or others for the lessons to remain operational. Measuring growth after breakthrough presents a challenge because the most important changes often aren't visible or quantifiable. You might be different in ways that don't show up on any external metric. Internal quiet where there used to be chaos. Stability where there used to be reactivity. Clarity where there used to be confusion. These changes matter enormously, but leave no evidence that could be measured or compared. External markers can help track whether the transformation is holding. You can observe whether the concrete changes you made post-breakdown remain in place. Are the boundaries you established still being honored? Are the patterns you changed still changed? Are the commitments you dropped still dropped? These observable facts provide some indication of whether drift has occurred or whether the transformation is holding structurally. Internal indicators require honest self-assessment. How do you feel on a typical day, compared to how you felt in the period leading up to breakdown? How quickly do you recover from stress compared to before? How well do you recognize when you're approaching your limits? How willing are you to act on that recognition? These questions don't produce numerical answers, but sitting with them honestly produces a sense of whether you're genuinely different or just going through the motions of change. Comparison with your pre-breakdown baseline works better than comparison with some ideal state you've never achieved. The question isn't whether you've become a perfectly balanced person who never struggles. The question is whether you're measurably better off than you were before things fell apart. Are you more sustainable? More aligned with what matters to you? Better at recognizing and responding to your own needs? More honest with yourself and others? More capable of setting limits and honoring them? If yes, the transformation is real. If the answer is unclear, it might be worth examining whether drift has occurred that needs addressing. The person you've become carries what you went through differently than you might expect. The weight of the breakdown doesn't disappear, but it distributes itself into something more manageable. The acute intensity passes. The constant preoccupation fades. The crisis becomes part of your history rather than your present experience. What remains is different than what you started with, not because you've overcome something, but because you've integrated something. That integrated something includes capacity you didn't have before. You know now that you can survive breaking down because you've done it. That knowledge lives in you regardless of whether you think about it consciously. The terror of falling apart loses some of its power when you've already fallen apart and discovered that falling apart wasn't the end. This isn't immunity from future crisis. Life can always deliver circumstances that overwhelm. It's familiarity with the territory of breakdown that makes future navigation less terrifying. The integrated something also includes wisdom about how you work, what you need, and where your limits actually are. Before the breakdown, you might have had theories about these things. Now you have data. You know what happens when certain limits get exceeded. You know what you actually need versus what you thought you needed. You know how you respond to certain kinds of pressure. This knowledge doesn't guarantee you'll honor it. Drift happens. Denial is always available, but the knowledge exists in a way it didn't before. You can't claim ignorance about yourself anymore. Your breakdown was not a detour from your life. It was part of your life, necessary for the person you're becoming in ways that will only become clear over time. The meaning of what you went through will continue revealing itself years from now as you discover how the crisis shaped you in ways you can't yet see. Growth doesn't end when the breakdown ends. Growth continues through every ordinary day that follows, informed and shaped by the extraordinary experience that changed everything. What happened to you didn't happen to break you. It happened to break something open, some structure that was too small, some pattern that was too limited, some version of yourself that couldn't contain who you're becoming. The breaking was real. The pain was real. And also, the breaking made room for something that didn't fit before. You carry that room with you now. What you do with it is the rest of your life. If this audiobook offered you any sort of value, then please check out my other books and listen to some of those as well when you get the chance. As always, thank you for your support.